Welcome in to Vol Basketball Fever, your number one source for discussions about the Vols and Lady Vols basketball programs. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video, and check in every week for new episodes of the show, video breakdowns, and more. Now, on with the episode. Hello everyone, and welcome in to another episode of Vol Basketball Fever. I am Nathanael Rutherford, joined by Gene Henley here on another episode of the show. Thank you all so much for tuning in, whether you're watching this on YouTube or whether you're listening to this on the podcast. I really appreciate you guys and all of the support you give us, all the effort you guys put in to helping out the show and making it, helping it grow and spread here even in the off season when we're still a good 2-ish months away from 2.5 months, I guess, from the start of the season. Actually, maybe less than that now. If I do the math right, I think we're under 2 months actually now, man. Time is flying, Gene. But we're under 2 months now from the start of the season for the men's side, and I think for Lady Vols too. So I know it's obviously right in the beginning, kind of heart of football season for Vol fans, but basketball will be here before you know it. Some practices and stuff already happening on campus. Saw, the Tennessee Hoops Twitter account putting out videos of them practicing together and doing some scrimmaging and doing some work. So they're practicing together, Gene. It'll be basketball time before you know it here in the college world. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Give this video a like if you're on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel if you were there and haven't yet. And then also subscribe to the podcast if you prefer the audio medium of the show. So Gene, last time we talked was about recruiting. Tennessee's been very hot on the recruiting show lately. But we also, since we last spoke, we had a full schedule drop for Tennessee. We had talked before about the schedule when it was the non-conference, and then I think we also talked a little bit about when the SEC teams were announced for Tennessee, but not necessarily they didn't have the actual schedule for Tennessee at that point. It was just kind of we knew who they're going to play, who was on the road, who was at home in SEC play. But now we have the full schedule released for everything from the start of the season to the end of it. So I'll run down that really quick. Try not to bore people to death with it, but I'll try to give you a lay of the land in terms of, what this schedule looks like for Tennessee. You start regular season November 7th against Tennessee Tech. Then you go to Nashville to finish up the series with Colorado to play the Buffaloes in Nashville and Bridgestone Arena. Host Florida Gulf Coast, former Dunk City over there. And then you go you go over to the Bahamas for the Battle for Atlantis, where you'll play Butler first, and then Tennessee will play either BYU or USC, and then hopefully playing in a title match for that one, and that is in late November around Thanksgiving. Come back at the end of November and host McNeese State, then you host Alcorn State, host Eastern Kentucky, and then you go up to Brooklyn to face Maryland. And then, Gene, you go on the road for your first true road matchup of the season. It'll be on December 17th in Tucson, Arizona, to take on the Arizona Wildcats. Tennessee hosted them last year. Now they're going to go on the road and play them. And then you come back to Knoxville a little bit before Christmas and host Austin Peay. And then you have Christmas break. And then you get to the end of December and start SEC play on the road again. Feels like Tennessee starts on the road and SEC play a lot. They play Ole Miss. And then the calendar turns to the new year. Then you come back to Knoxville, host Mississippi State, on the road against South Carolina, host Vanderbilt, host Kentucky. So that's the first time you face Kentucky is January 14th. Back on the road to face Mississippi State, also on the road to face LSU, host Georgia, host Texas for the SEC Big 12 Challenge. That's obviously going to be a big one. On the road against Florida, host Auburn and Bruce Pearl the day after my birthday, Gene. February 4th was when that one's going to be. Looking to get some tickets for that one for my birthday. Then you go to Middle Tennessee for a quote-unquote road game against Vanderbilt. Host Missouri, host Alabama, on the road against Kentucky on February 18th. Stay on the road and go to Texas A&M. Host South Carolina, host Arkansas, and then you close the season. It feels like almost every year now, it feels like Tennessee's closing the SEC regular season playing Auburn, and they'll close it on the road. So Tennessee, the senior day this year will be February 28th against Arkansas, and then Tennessee will close out the regular season on the road. Same way they start the SEC season, Gene, on the road, this time against Auburn, though. So I think we talked a little bit about the non-conference schedule before, it being, tough, but not, I don't think, as grueling as Tennessee's had some non-conference schedules in the past. Obviously, I think Texas is going to be the top team that Tennessee faces, unless, of course, Tennessee gets to the end of the Battle for Orlando State. I do not recall the whole field there, but I know it's a pretty interesting field. And if you get to the title game for that one, there's a good chance they're going to be facing. I'll look up the slate of teams while you're talking and find out who they are, because I know it's some pretty good teams. Maryland will be interesting. Arizona will be interesting. But again, I think Texas will be the cream of the crop for Tennessee's non-conference schedule. And then I think for the first time in a few years, Gene, I think Tennessee's opening for SEC play, again, right now, looking at this in mid-September, I think it's actually not bad. You start on the road, which is not going to be fun. You play Ole Miss, Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt as your first 4 SEC games. That's all, I would say, games that Tennessee should win. Again, that's right now in mid-September, all on paper. But those are 4 games I think Tennessee should win. And then you face Kentucky for your 5th game, and it's at home, which is where you beat them last year. And, of course, Tennessee didn't lose a home game last season. So even the 5th game, that's not so bad, considering Kentucky's I think is going to be pretty good this year. But your first game against them is at home. Then back on the road against Mississippi State. LSU will be a very intriguing team this year, with basically being they are a whole new team this year. And then Georgia, and then Texas. So really up into that Texas game, I mean, again, this is very early. The season's still a month and a half or more away from starting. I see maybe again, a couple road games in there, so maybe 2 SEC losses up until that Texas game, which I think Tennessee has a chance, Gene, to start off really well this year, with both non-conference slate being a little easier than years past, and with the start of the SEC season, I think, being easier than what Tennessee's had in the past. I think Tennessee has a really good chance of starting off really hot. And you and I were talking before we started recording here, and I think this is kind of I wouldn't say best case scenario, but as you said, I think it's kind of ideal for the way this team is constructed to kind of have the ability to kind of ease into things a little bit. Obviously, your second game of the season against Colorado, so that's not going to be, technically easing into things, but I still think Tennessee should win that game, especially with it being in the state of Tennessee. But all in all, that's not a bad first 3 months of the schedule. That's a very, very winnable games, but not against top tier teams that I think will be like Elite 8, Final 4 caliber on all those games. But you're playing teams that are, I think, a handful of teams that'll make the NCAA tournament. And I think this team, while returning a lot of pieces from last year, still has some very key newcomers that need to get their feet underneath them in the orange and white. And this is to me, it looks like a pretty strong possible start for Tennessee this season on the schedule.
Right. So at the beginning of season, when coaches are putting schedules together, I typically like to look at what the schedules look like. And in a lot of cases, at least specifically in Tennessee's case, the way they schedule is kind of, will tell me a lot about how maybe the coach feels about the team. So when the year that Tennessee went to the Sweet 16 with Grant and Admiral, that was a difficult non-conference schedule. I mean, obviously they had Gonzaga. I want to say, I can't remember if they played Villanova or somebody up in New York. I can't remember exactly. I just joined the beat, and I just remember people were like blowing my phone up. Or no, it was the Gonzaga game, and then they played Memphis. So they had a bunch of games. And that's kind of what you want. Like, if you don't necessarily know what to expect from your team, then you schedule accordingly. Like, if you've got guys that you kind of want to get their feet wet in terms of just like getting on-court action, then you don't schedule crazy. And so, you look at the non-conference schedule, obviously there's some nice games in there, but there's also Gulf Coast, who has a brand new coach, Tennessee Tech, who's lost players, Colorado, who you don't really necessarily feel is like all that much of a threat. Obviously the Battle for Atlantis. You've got Butler, you've got BYU, USC. I think NC State's on that other side. Some teams that are Dayton's on the other side, Kansas, Wisconsin. Like you've got some other some teams that at least look like they could be pretty formidable. But again, it's just a chance to build. And obviously, you don't turn down a chance to play in the Battle for Atlantis. That's just kind of how it works. You just don't do that, because then you come back and you play McNeese State, Alcorn State, Eastern Kentucky. Those are everybody feels good. Somebody has some sort of ridiculous. One of the lesser known guys has some ridiculous shooting performance, and the fan base immediately starts questioning why that kid doesn't play more later in the season, when inevitably, that your team goes through some shooting woes. Then even, you get Maryland and Arizona right before conference play. And again, you look at conference play and you've got teams, who, like you said, there are questions about. I understand Ole Miss is a tough team, but this should be a win. Mississippi State, kind of the same thing. South Carolina, I know they got G.G. Jackson, but that's still a young team. That's not. I think, going to have some struggles. I mean, when you look at some of the players that Lamont brought in, I mean, he brought in the best player from the Citadel, who was like a 6'6" kid who, obviously he's a good player, but he's like a 6'6" post player, and he's not Grant Williams.
Yep.
So there's only so much that you can truly expect to get there. So, and then you have a Vanderbilt team that lost some key people, obviously lost Scottie Pippen Jr. and Rodney Chapman. They're basically their entire backcourt from that team. And so you've got some opportunities before you get into Kentucky, the LSU, who you don't know anything about this year. Probably the biggest wild card. The only thing you know about LSU is that they likely won't be playing in March.
For one reason or the other. I can't remember if they're facing a suspension or not, but for one reason or another, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, I could confidently say that they're not going to be playing in March. Could be wrong because, crazy things happen and investigations seem to take forever, but it's what it is. So, I don't see the heavy hitters in this league, especially when you're talking about, Georgia has a new coach, Florida has a new coach. You've got spots there where it's going. I mean, when as we speak here on September 14th, there's not really a ton of knowledge as to what to expect from some of the teams that you're playing. Now you'll have more information come January. In a lot of these cases, like teams that may be good, maybe not. We don't know. But right now, we don't have a ton of knowledge. So at least on this date, you feel confident, you feel comfortable about where your schedule is, because, you could get into February and have already been around 19 wins. So even if you struggle a little bit in February, you can go 3-5 in February and you still feel pretty good about yourself because you're 22-10 or something along those lines. So again, I think if you're a team that there are questions about, look, I get it. Josiah is back. I think we're going to get into him a little bit later. Vescovi's back. And I'm trying to think of just key players that's back, and I'm really kind of I don't know of many. Oh, I'm sorry, the point guard, Ziegler. You've got those three. Those are the three key players that are back, and you feel comfortable with those pieces. But everything else around it, there are questions, and that's with apologies to Plavsic, who is a try hard player. But I think he's just pretty limited. But, obviously, that's not a kid. You know what you're getting from him, but I can't say that the answer to that is an awful lot. So with some pieces that need to be figured out, you certainly want to have a schedule like this that gives you an opportunity to figure some stuff out, figure out how good the Phillips kid's going to be, figure out if BJ Edwards is going to be a nice little hometown sort of story, the kid from Johnson City who plays his high school ball in Knoxville and people fell in love with, had a really great game against some really great talent. And one time I saw him play live when Knox Catholic played IMG back in 2020, or maybe it was 2019, I can't remember. But yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of questions that you don't necessarily know the answer to yet. So you want to have a schedule to where, you get through the non-conference, you get into the early part of conference play, and you slowly start to answer those questions, and you don't have to have those answers immediately.
By the way, the other Battle for Atlantis teams, obviously Tennessee, BYU, Butler, USC are the ones that just mentioned, but the other big headliner besides Tennessee probably is Kansas. Wisconsin, Dayton, and NC State are the other ones too. I thought Kansas was one, but I could not remember. But I thought it was because I remember talking about the potential of another Tennessee-Kansas game. It would be interesting if it ended up being Tennessee and Kansas playing in that title game for that, Gene, because then you'd have Tennessee playing two Big 12 teams in the same season, which doesn't happen. It doesn't happen often that Tennessee, that any school will play two schools from a power conference in the same season that aren't, in your current conference. A lot of times, Tennessee last year played two teams in the, or technically they ended up playing three because they played Longwood from that whatever conference that was, not Patriot, but that small conference.
Big South.
Yeah, thank you. That happened. The Big South, like that'll happen. You'll play a couple teams from maybe a smaller conference like that, or a mid-major conference, but not often that you play two teams from a major conference that aren't your conference. So it'd be cool if Tennessee played Kansas, then also played Texas, but also think it'd be cool if Tennessee played Wisconsin or NC State, or Dayton. I mean, I don't think it'll be Dayton, but it could be Dayton. So we'll see what the Battle for Atlantis brings. Again, we know they'll play BYU. We know whatever happens in that BYU game, Tennessee will end up playing, or Butler, excuse me. Tennessee will play Butler to start off, and then whatever happens that game, win or lose, Tennessee will play either BYU or USC. It's just a matter of if they win or lose that game, kind of what happens afterwards. So we'll see. But Tennessee has those games, as you mentioned, like there's, I think you're going to feel good unless there's injury, unless something, really strange happens. I think as a Vol fan, you're probably going to feel good about where Tennessee is heading into SEC play, and then heading into that first matchup with Kentucky again on January 14th, mid-January. I think Tennessee is going to Vol fans will feel pretty good about where Tennessee is record-wise, at least, because as you kind of laid out there, Gene, there's a lot of flux and kind of new in the SEC this year. There's a lot of potential for these teams. You talked about South Carolina. I mean, I think, I know we both have kind of a potential to be biased about South Carolina because of who their head coach is, former head coach at the UTC who you covered over there too. But as you mentioned, like they may have gotten the really, really talented number one overall prospect to come, play for them, but they're still overall going to be pretty young and pretty new. And I don't know how much talent they're going to have around him necessarily. I think they'll be a decent team, but Ole Miss, I don't know how good they're going to be. Mississippi State, I don't know. I expect Vanderbilt to take another. I know they lost Scottie Pippen, so I don't know. I think they finally maybe have found something and have got a chip on their shoulder with their head coach of kind of playing and seeing, what they can do for the next step. But I still think overall Tennessee fans are going to be fairly happy with where Tennessee's record stands by the time you get to that Kentucky game, and then probably by the time you get to the Texas game for the Big 12 SEC Challenge at the end of January. So, Gene, this is going to be. We'll obviously preview the season more once we get closer to it. And oops, our mic was messed up there. And once we get closer to the season, we'll do our predictions like we did last year and kind of previewing, and we'll probably follow a similar cadence. If you guys are new to the podcast or new to the show, last year, I want to say. I can't remember when exactly. I can look it up in a second, but I know close to when the season began, we did a roster review for both the men's and women's teams in two different episodes where we looked at, recapping kind of everything that happened in the offseason, all the departures, all the newcomers, and kind of expectations for the players that are returning and for the newcomers, and kind of just did a whole big roster breakdown and review of both the Vols and Lady Vols. So we'll do that again. And then shortly after that is when we did our season prediction piece episode, whatever, where I don't think we gave like an exact record prediction for either, the Vols or Lady Vols. We kind of gave our, actually that might've been when I had Maria, that might've been when I first had her on for the Lady Vol episode, but regardless, for the men's side, Gene, I don't think we gave an exact record prediction, but we gave kind of a range and kind of how we felt about what the team could end up being. And we looked at it last year at the end of the, season, Gene, and they exceeded our expectations at the beginning of the year. If you want to go back and, as a listener and go back, and that was before we did video, so it would just be the audio of the podcast, go back and listen to our predictions where I think we predicted Tennessee to have by the end of the regular season, not just once you got into March and everything. I think we both predict Tennessee to have like 9-10 losses or close to that, and thought that would be good. We thought Tennessee getting 22, 23 wins would be a pretty solid season and kind of where we expected them to. So I know people want to harp on how the season ended, and it's fair to still criticize. I'm not saying you can't criticize the team, but I think a lot of people last year were kind of in this similar boat that we were, in that we expected Tennessee to be pretty good and probably finish top 4 in the SEC in the regular season. But I still will go on record and say they exceeded my expectations from last year. And I don't know about this team. Well, again, we're still a little too far out for me to have a full grasp on kind of what I expect the record necessarily to be. But I mean, there's a good chance this team could maybe exceed expectations again for me. We'll get into some of the national expectations in a second, but I mean, last year's team exceeded expectations, and this year's going to be a very interesting one to kind of try to nail down. And even if the record to me might be really good by the time you're like getting into February, because the quality of schedule I don't think is going to be as good in years past. I still think it'll be, good. I'll be interested to see if Tennessee only has like 3-4 losses by the time you're getting into February, kind of where their RPI, where their net ranking and stuff is, Gene, because I feel like in years past they've been buoyed by having a really good strength of the schedule and playing a lot of really high regarded teams. I still think they'll have a pretty good strength of the schedule, but I don't think it's going to be as good in years past. So my point is the record may look really good, but the RPI, the Ken Palm ranking and stuff may not quite match up to what people maybe expect. But anyway, we'll get into the national expectations in a second, but I just kind of rambled a little bit about that because, again, last year they exceeded expectations. The year before that, they didn't, but again, it was a COVID year, so that was hard to really nail down. But I think this year, though, Gene, I think if you're going to lean one way or the other, for me, in terms of could they exceed expectations, or are they more likely to undermine? What's the word I'm looking for? To not reach expectations, I guess. I think this team, because they're a little more veteran, at least in terms of comparing them to other teams in the country. You look at the 3 guys that return there. You look at Cam Wall, who's coming back and hopefully stays healthy. Roche coming back as a key bench player. Even Key isn't, he's new to Tennessee, but he's been in college for a while, so you can technically, count him as at least an experienced college player. I think because of all that, Tennessee, and then also bringing in Julian Phillips, who has a lot of potential, I think that to me makes me lean a little bit more towards exceeding expectations. But then you can also make, I think, an argument, and I'd like to hear your side of it, because of a lot of the new being brought in and also losing some key pieces like Kennedy Chandler, for example, from last year, that maybe you could also argue that they take a step back and underachieve a little bit compared to what expectations are. So before we get into the national stuff, Gene, I'm curious, do you lean one way or the other? Do you think this team is more likely to kind of exceed expectations or underachieve? Because right now it's looking like consensus is Tennessee is a top 15, maybe top 10 team nationally. We'll get to talking about that in just a second, about one specific poll, but I lean maybe towards overachieving before I say underachieving in this regard.
Well, I'd probably lean a little more.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't talk about this one before.
Yeah,
so sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I just, I can't. Honestly, I can't really go either way, just because, I know we're about to get into rankings, and that'll probably, if what we're about to talk about is the consensus, then I would say they're going to underachieve that. But we'll get in more than that, so it's probably just best just move on now.
Okay, yeah, just go ahead and move on to it, because I think you're right. I think it goes in easier to the next thing. So I teased this at the end of the last episode, so we talked about it a little bit already, but I wanted to bring it back up again because I'm going to see if there's other. We're in mid September, so there aren't a whole lot of rankings and stuff out, but the Blue Ribbon men's basketball preseason rankings came out a few weeks ago. I don't remember when exactly. Here goes. I guess it was September 1st. Yeah. Because around then, because it looks like that was when this website for North Carolina fans wrote about it. So North Carolina, I think, was actually number 1 in the Blue Ribbon poll. It looks like, according to isn't just the UNC site; it is the UNC site. It's the official UNC basketball account or website that wrote about it. They are number 1 in the Blue Ribbon College Basketball Yearbook Preseason Top 25. That's a mouthful. Chris Dortch, who listeners here probably know who he is, has obviously been doing college basketball stuff for a very long time. Now with Blue Ribbon for a long time too. North Carolina's number 1. You had Gonzaga 2, Kentucky 3, Houston 4, Duke 5, Arkansas 6, which is interesting. That's the second SEC team, with Kentucky 3rd, Arkansas 6th, Kansas 7th, UCLA 8th, Baylor 9th, and then Tennessee at number 10. So that is your top 10. Some other notable ones: Alabama at 13, Texas at 14, Auburn at 15, Arizona at 19, who Tennessee plays, Texas A&M at 21, Dayton, who Tennessee could play in the Battle for Atlantis, at 23. So those are, again, some ones of note there that Tennessee will have on the schedule, and potentially Dayton on the schedule as well, depending on how the Battle for Atlantis goes. So Tennessee being number 10 there, Gene, with being number 3 in the SEC. Obviously, Chris Dortch very high on Arkansas because I think in part because they just had a massive recruiting haul in the offseason, and also brought in, again, just like he's had in years past, some pretty good transfers too. Eric Musselman did to Arkansas. Kentucky, again, massive recruiting haul, but that's to be expected from them. We talked about that, I think, last episode of the best recruiters or highest ranked recruiters in college basketball, what the Field of 68 did, which we'll talk about them again in a second. But they had Calipari number 1, and that was, to me, couldn't argue anybody else except for him at number 1. But Kentucky brought in, again, just another elite class of recruiting. Arkansas brought in a really elite class of recruiting. Tennessee, no slouch of recruiting either. And then also, again, brought in Terry Key as a transfer. But also, I think we touched on this a little bit at the end of the show last time, Gene. I think as much as it is Tennessee brought in another solid recruiting class, and with Julian Phillips being the headliner there, I think Tennessee's ranking has a little bit more to do with the fact that they return a pretty sizable chunk of their production from last year, of guys who started or were basically starters in Zakai Ziegler's case, where you bring in, you lose Kennedy Chandler, you lose John Fulkerson, but those are really the only 2 major contributors you lose, unless I'm for some reason blanking on somebody. But those are obviously the 2 biggest ones, in my opinion, you lost. And Fulkerson wasn't the Fulky of old, but he was still obviously a contributor, still a guy who gave you 26, 27 minutes a game and was still productive, and was still a guy that was still, the name of Tennessee was, he was the heart and soul of Tennessee for years, because he's the, not hometown guy, but he's the in-state guy. Just obviously fans loved him a whole lot too. So you lose those 2, and then obviously you lose Brendan Huntley Hatfield, transferred out, Justin Powell transferred out, VJ Bailey transferred out, and then Quentin DeBonge transferred out as well. But those, Huntley Hatfield was the biggest contributor of that group. But even then, he wasn't, I don't think he's a massive loss in terms of what he gave you. He's maybe a massive loss based on potential, but we've talked ad nauseum about him, Gene. I don't want to keep rehashing Brandon Huntley Hatfield until the season begins. We can see what he does at Louisville. But Tennessee returns, again, Zakai Ziegler, Josiah-Jordan James, Santiago Vescovi, Olivier Campbell is back healthy and hopefully stays that way. And then you still have a Jonas Adu and Urosh Pashvik off the bench as, guys who did well off the bench last year and even made, starts. I don't think Adu did, but Urosh definitely started a few games last year. Adu didn't start. He played 19 games. He never started. But Urosh, by the way, started 21 games last year, played in all 35. In fact, he's one of the only players last year that played in all 35 games for Tennessee. You had him, Santi, and Zakai. And actually, Brendan Huntley Hatfield apparently appeared in all 35 games. But those are the only guys that played in all 35 games with Tennessee last year. Kennedy missed a game. Josiah missed a few games. Campbell obviously missed quite a few games. Fulkerson missed a couple games. So you had, even Victor Bailey, I think he only missed one. There's obviously several games where he played very little minutes in those games. But you're returning a big chunk of experience, and a lot of it is in spots that you'd like to have experience in. Obviously, Zakai's only a sophomore, but he's still a guy who was here last year and is going to be, your main point guard for the season. You bring back a guy in Josiah-Jordan James, who is your best defender and started to really flash a lot of his offensive potential down the stretch last year. Vescovi has quietly been one of the best 3-point shooters in the SEC in his 3 years at Tennessee. Like it's kind of remarkable to me how much he hasn't really been talked about as a 3-point shooter, like as an elite 3-point shooter, because he's been really good. He's got a really good shot, Gene, of finishing behind only Chris Lofton in a number of shooting categories by the time he is done at Tennessee. And it's going to be like, only behind Lofton with like 3-pointers made, 3-pointers attempted, 3-point percentage. Like the only guy he's going to finish that's going to be better than him as a Vol in a lot of those categories is going to be Chris Lofton. And yet I just don't feel like Vescovi's gotten the attention that, obviously not anywhere close to what Lofton did, but I just don't feel like he's gotten the attention and the recognition over the last few years that maybe he deserves for how good of a shooter he's been for Tennessee. And then again, you throw in, if Cam Walker can stay healthy, he kind of was starting to show a little bit more potential, kind of cashing in his potential last year before he got hurt. So I think Tennessee's ranking has more to do with the guys that return. But I feel like this is going to be an outlier. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't see Tennessee being a preseason top 10 team for the AP poll, for example. Maybe I'm wrong, though, because I look at some of the teams that Tennessee's kind of around in Chris Dortch's rankings, Gene. Again, you have Kansas at 7, Arkansas at 6, UCLA 8, Baylor 9. Those are the kind of the 4 teams immediately in front of them. And the 4 teams that behind them are Creighton, Indiana, Alabama, and Texas. And then you have Auburn at 15. Maybe Tennessee is going to be a top 10 team, Gene. I mean, I think if Tennessee is a top 10 preseason team, it might speak more to the fact that there's just so much unknown with a lot of rosters in college basketball, more than it does that I think maybe the actual potential of Tennessee's roster, because I don't know that from what I've seen of this team, I'm ready to say top 10. I would say top 15. I would say I would put them at anywhere between kind of 15 to 13, maybe 12. I don't know that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know that I would say this team is a top 10 team. And to me, top 10 for them is if Julian Phillips is a very solid contributor, if Tyreek Key is healthy and is able to do for Tennessee anywhere close to what he did at Indiana State. And then Josiah, again, is able to continue his offensive output, not what he was doing at the end of the year last year. I don't expect him to keep shooting 40 to 45% from 3. But if he's still going to be a consistent offensive player for Tennessee along with his defense, then I think Tennessee's a top 10 team. I just don't know, like right now, I'm ready to say Tennessee should be a preseason top 10 team. Mm-hmm. But again, maybe it's more of a byproduct of all the unknown of college basketball and the fact that Tennessee has quite a bit of known coming back.
All right, so I'm going to take a slightly different view of this. And maybe this is like, maybe it's not. I don't really care. So we can look at this one of two ways. And obviously, the thought of, man, Tennessee, top 10 team in the country. It's like, man, are they good enough? What? And that's 1,000% fine, because obviously the shock value of seeing number 10 in the country is something. But then while you were talking, I was thinking, what does top 10 in the country actually mean? It means that if you are a top 10 team at the end of the season, guess what? You got beaten the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament. And that would not be something that the fan base wants. It looks good. Like, it does look good. And it's part of the reason why, I understand why rankings are so important in college athletics, but especially in basketball, what does it actually mean? Because in basketball, it can't mean much. It just doesn't. It's a number. It's assigning a value to a team to get people, to watch certain games, because you have 9th ranked such and such playing 11th ranked such and such, or top ranked such and such playing 5th ranked, blah 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 blah, and so on and so forth. So I think that Tennessee has built up a reputation over the past few years to be considered one of the top teams in the country, just based off of the name. How high, if you told me if you wanted to say 10, I'm not going to push back on that. I'm not going to push back at all on Tennessee being a top 10 team in the country. Because if we think of it from that perspective, then top 10 in the country does not mean that the expectations nationally, like outside of Knoxville, are as high as maybe you want them to be. Because, again, if we're just looking at it in theory, top 10 is number 10 in the country is a Sweet 16 team. Top 8 means, Elite 8. Mm-hmm. I understand there's so many things that go into it. I get it. The tournament is weird. I'm the first person to say that. I get it. I'm just saying expectations. You're not going to put a team 17th in the country and then say this is a Final Four team.
Yeah, right.
Right. So the expectation is that, this team could win some games in March. Without knowing much more about them, we'll say they can win 2. And we'll just live with those two games in March, and let the chips fall where they may. If we're wrong, then we're not going to be wrong by much. So, there are a lot of questions, and so that's why whenever you had posed the previous question, I was like, well, I'm not exactly sure. And then while you talked, they gave me a couple minutes to kind of think about how I wanted to attack it. I think there are very specific questions about this team. Can you get a bucket inside if you need it? Fulkerson could do it occasionally, even last year at the age of 24. Huntley Hatfield occasionally did it, but that wasn't really what he wanted to do. Adu did it on occasion, and so did Urosh. Olivier was probably your best consistently at that. Fulkerson was a little too up and down for my liking there. Urosh was as well, but I think there was a point where he had gotten pretty comfortable with himself. So if he's fully ready to go and fully, those injuries take a little while, in terms of just actually getting back into full action, especially, he'll have 20,000 people excited to see him back. We'll see where that is. And then can he and Adu form a formidable 1-2 combination? What happens with Phillips? Where does he fit in the scheme? Because you do feel pretty good about 4 guys starting. Obviously the 3 guards and Olivier. And what are you going to do with the other spot? You're going to go with Adu. You're going to go with this 5-star freshman who could be program changing. Because again, point guards look great and it's all fine and dandy. 2-way wings win in March. That's a tell as old as time. National Player of the Year was the kid from Kansas, and that was a 2-way 6'6" wing that could play off. They could go score 20 and typically guard your best player. And I think that's what he'll do at the next level. That's kind of what Josiah is, 2-way wing. Those are the guys that win you games in March, and so. If they can have some semblance of that, then they've got a chance to be pretty good this year. But it's so early, and nothing about anybody other than Olivier in terms of just what these guys and they do as well. But what will he do with an increased role? Will he start? Is he perfectly fine being first man off the bench if need be? With Urosh, how many minutes can he give you? Where those fouls going to come from? All these little things that if you're a coach and if you're anybody, you're thinking about these things. Where can I get this production from? Can I get 15 points in the paint a game? Are we going to shoot a bunch of threes? What happens when we don't hit those threes? That was always my question last year, especially early on when Kennedy was making 85% from 3-point range. And everybody was getting really excited because, Tennessee was shacking up 43s a game and shooting 40%. It was going to happen. And they struggled when those shots didn't fall. I think it was the Texas Tech game. So there are going to be some of those questions, and it's fair to ask that. Now, the thing was, last year they got those things answered relatively quick. You got some production from Fulkerson down the stretch. Huntley Hatfield didn't play horribly. I just think that there's another level when the guy that's coaching you is a post guy as opposed to more of a guard guy. If you look at Tennessee's best players typically, So, I don't think you got little production from Huntley Hatfield, but not a lot. I mean, so there are a lot of questions that, entering this season. So when you look at things from just hey, okay, Tennessee's a top 10 team in the country. Cool. That also means, if you told me that they were top 10 and they were number 8, I'm like, hey, that's an Elite 8 team. If you're telling me they're 10, you're Sweet 16. And last time I checked, they lived in the Sweet 16 for a little longer than Tennessee fans care to recall.
For some context, a couple of different things for some context. At the end of the season last year, in the final Ken Palm rankings, just for example, Tennessee finished 9th. So, and they started the season preseason 13th in the Ken Palm. So there wasn't a whole lot of fluctuation. I just think that's, Tennessee again finished top 10, but like you said, Gene, they didn't make it a Sweet 16 last year. So they, that's not. I think that's a really good point that you raised. That in context, what is a top 10 team in college basketball? Unless you're top 8, it's a team that doesn't make it past the Sweet 16. So that's, if you're 10 or 9th, you're at least projection wise, if you're top 10, you're a team that I think people think you can make an Elite 8 run potentially and could be an outside shot of a Final Four team. But usually the people who think Final Four teams, they put them in the top 5, and they say you're a dark horse if you're in that kind of 6 to 13-ish range. Usually if you're in that range, it's kind of this is a dark horse Final Four team. You're right. Like it's different. I think when you put in that context, it's different. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. So maybe I think you kind of swayed me a little bit to your side of it, or at least that side of it, saying, maybe this team should be a top 10 team. Some more context too, that I think is really interesting about Tennessee men's basketball. Tennessee's only been ranked in the preseason top 25 in men's basketball 16 times ever, which that was kind of shocking to me. That's the amount that Tennessee has been ranked preseason. They've obviously ended up being ranked more often by the end of the season, and also during the season they've ended up becoming ranked by the time the season's gotten a couple games in or whatever. So Tennessee's been ranked more than just that, but preseason wise, Tennessee's been a top 25 team only 16 times. And I looked at it, Gene, 9 of those have come come since the year 2000. So from, this millennium, I guess, from 2000 preseason onward into, and up until last preseason, 9 of those 16 times Tennessee's been ranked in the preseason have come in the last 22 seasons, I guess. Before that, a lot of not being ranked in the top 25 preseason. And I mentioned this at the end of last show too. Tennessee's been a preseason top 10 team only 6 times in program history. So if they do it this year, it'd be the 7th. It would be the second time for Rick Barnes. Yeah, second time for Rick Barnes. They started the 18-19 season 6th in the preseason, which was the highest Tennessee's ever been ranked in the preseason. Back in 07-08, or back in preseason of 07, Bruce Pearl, Tennessee was ranked number 7th in the preseason. In the 1975 preseason under Ray Mears, they were 9th. Jerry Green had them ranked 9th twice in the 1998 preseason and the 2000 preseason. And then Bruce Pearl had them ranked 10th in the 2009 preseason. So it would be historically for Tennessee. I mean, this has just been an unprecedented, it has been unprecedented for Tennessee. It would be an unprecedented run of being in the top 10 because you'd have, again, 2018 was a top 10 team. 2007 was a top 10 team. 2009 was a top 10 team. That's 3 times in the past, 12 years or so. And if it happens again, it'd be 4 times in the past 12, 13 years or so. And that's never happened for Tennessee. That would be the best stretch for Tennessee ever in terms of preseason rankings. Again, it's more important where you finish, I guess, technically where you finish in the AP poll, but also where you finish in March for that respect too. But I just think that's just such a interesting marker for Tennessee that it's so, we talked about this in the expectations episode, Gene, like it's just so weird and interesting and cool to me to look at kind of the expectations of the program over the last 15 years as opposed to where they were pre-Bruce Pearl especially, but really kind of once you got into the mid-2000s, because even earlier in Bruce Pearl, like it was a big shock that Tennessee was this good. Like I remember even being a kid being surprised like how good Tennessee just suddenly was under Bruce Pearl, and then especially when they rose to that number 1 ranking for the first time ever. Like it was such a shock and a joy because for one, it never happened, but 2, that was kind of the start of the decline for football. So like Vol fans are looking for anything to hang their hat on. Obviously, you had the Lady Vols too, but you had basketball. That was kind of it, because baseball was starting to decline at that point too. Which UT fans didn't care as much about baseball back then, nearly as much as they do now. Not in the mid 2000s and kind of early 2010s, especially. But it was just such a shock back then to how good Tennessee was, and then that kind of rose the expectations a bit. I wouldn't say maybe a bit. I would argue quite a bit, like we talked about in that episode. But it's so interesting to me to see how different the expectations have become. Because like you said, I think Tennessee has earned, under Rick Barnes, they've earned the respect of the media, because Barnes already had it, I think, for what he did at Texas. The media respected him, and obviously people did make fun of him then and still make fun of him now for the mishaps in March. But overall, I think he's to me, I think, Gene, he is the most respected head coach in terms of how other coaches view him and how the media views him that Tennessee men's basketball has ever had. I could be wrong. Maybe Ray Mears was, more respected than Rick Barnes was back in the day. But from my time of being on this earth and for, the last 40 years of men's basketball, I don't know that you could argue that any other coach Tennessee's had is more respected, well-liked, and esteemed by his peers and by the media than Rick Barnes. Like, there's no other argument. No, people don't like Bruce Pearl. Like, the fans did. Other coaches don't like Bruce Pearl. Media likes him because he's engaging and he says good things, but they also acknowledge that he has a very scummy underbelly. He wasn't liked. Jerry Green. No, I like Jerry Green. I mean, nobody liked Jerry Green. I don't think Jerry Green likes Jerry Green. Look at Kevin O'Neal. He sucked. No one liked him. People didn't like Buzz Peterson. Media has a weird soft spot for Konzo Martin, but I don't think he compares anywhere close to Rick Barnes in terms of respect by the media. And I think coaches respect Konzo Martin because he's a good guy. Tough-nosed guy too. I think he is respected. I just don't think it's to the degree Rick Barnes is. And obviously, Wade Houston was not respected because he was not a good coach on the court. So I don't think there's an argument, Gene. I think Rick Barnes is, I think, building off your point, I think he's a guy that part of the reason Tennessee's getting the acclaim they have the last few seasons has been because Rick Barnes is he's not a blue blood coach. There needs to be like another, whatever that category is that's right below blue blood. I think that's what kind of how Rick Barnes is viewed in the coaching world and by media, is that he's not a blue blood head coach, but he's a guy who's been around for a long time, almost won 700 games, or maybe has won 700 games. I forget now. But he's been around for decades. I mean, he's been in college basketball as a head coach since the late 80s. He's been around for a long time. Yeah, he's won well over 700 games. He's won 754 games as a head coach. So 150 of those at Tennessee. Sorry, I just kind of rambled, Gene. If you want to share your thoughts on anything I said there before we move on to the next topic, feel free to. I think you made a good point about kind of how you view the top 10, and also the fact that part of that, I think, too, is the fact that Tennessee under Rick Barnes has garnered a lot of respect because they've been able to produce at a higher level than what Tennessee has normally produced at in men's basketball, at least.
No, good. We can go ahead and move on.
All right. Well, then we'll move on to the last topic here. This one, I think, we're bringing up Field of 68 again, which, if you aren't familiar with who they are, if you hadn't listened to one of the previous podcasts where we talked about their ranking of the top recruiting head coaches in college basketball, their bio reads that they are a college basketball podcasting network that brings together a new generation of creators and the kind of content you can only get from people that live the game. So basically, they're big podcasting network that talks about college basketball. They have some team-specific podcasts they do too, but a lot of the people who are on the podcast for them are former players and played at a high level too in a lot of cases. So I think overall they do a good job. We've talked about them multiple times here on the show for both good and bad reasons. For if you're a Vol fan, for both negative and positive things. But bringing it up here now, Gene, because they're teasing this almanac they have coming out, which is why we talked about the recruiting rankings for Rick Barnes and where he ranks among head coaches. But they're also now teasing kind of their top 100 players in college basketball. And there's a Tennessee player right now. They're going through on their Twitter and kind of giving the rankings without any, I guess, without any context technically, but without any kind of breakdowns and stuff, and teasing their almanac that's coming out. We can pre-order it. It's called The Almanac, the Year of the Big. They're teasing it for 20% off right now. They've collaborated with Three Man Weave, VC and HC, which I forget what those stand for, but I know three-man weave. I follow several of the guys who work for three-man weave, and I think they're pretty good, in my opinion. But they are doing the top 100. They're in the 40s now, but a few, almost, I guess, a week and a half ago at this point, they had the grouping of 69 through 72, and Tennessee players in 72. It might not be the one you're thinking. It's Josiah-Jordan James, and Vescovy has been nowhere to be found so far. He wasn't before Josiah that I saw, unless I missed him. He wasn't anywhere in the 73 to 100 range unless I just missed him, and he hasn't been anywhere since then. And I don't think he's going to be a top 40, top 30 type player. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe they have him in the 35 to 40 range, Gene, but I feel like Josiah might end up being the only player on Tennessee's roster who ends up being in this top 100. If that's the case, I think it's interesting to me that he's the one they chose. My gut would have said Vescovy would have been higher ranked because of his offensive prowess. But the more I thought about it, I thought, maybe it makes more sense for Josiah to be there because of his offensive game coming on like it did last year, and the fact that even before his offense came on, he was an elite defender as soon as he got on campus for Tennessee. Like he might have been Tennessee's best defender as soon as he hit the roster. Every year since then, he's going to be Tennessee's best defender this year. You add in when he does rebounding, you add in the fact that he's not a bad ball handler. He's a good passer from his wing spot, and when he's able to dish back out, when he's driving to the basket and stuff too. I actually think, it makes sense for him to be the highest rated player on Tennessee's roster from the field of 68's perspective. Again, unless Vescovy sneaks into that top 40, between 30 and 40, I don't think it'd be top 30. Gene, what's it say about the team that Josiah is probably the highest rated player, at least, by one service, by the field of 68? What does it say about Tennessee, in your opinion, that Josiah is viewed as the best player on the team by the field of 68? And it's not being a Vescovy, it's not being someone else.
Yeah, I think it's just simply that the entire skill set matters. And obviously, I don't want anything to be taken as knocks on any particular players or anything of that nature, but the entire skill set matters. You could, you put Josiah in the 70s at 72, and if he was a consistent finisher, you could make an argument that he'd be way higher. Because that's really the biggest knock on his game, is he just probably is not a great finisher for a guy his size. But he literally does everything else on the basketball court. Rebounds, he guards, 4 or 5 positions. He can guard bigs, he can guard, wings, he can guard point guards. He's a good passer. He does all those things, and that matters in this day. I just made the comment earlier about how, you win with wings in college basketball. You win with wings, two-way wings at any level. In the professional ranks, you have to have. Heck, people were trying to argue for Andrew Wiggins being MVP of the finals for the Warriors because he had one good game, and plus there's obviously a faction of people who just didn't, just look for reasons to not give it to Steph Curry. But again, that was also very huge for the Warriors. You don't win without Wiggins. The way Wiggins played, he'll give you 20 points a game and guard the other team's best player. That matters at every level, regardless of the guards. You can have all the flashy point guards and everything you want. You win with two-way wings. You just do. That ends up being the difference. And so if you have a guy like Josiah, then that's a guy who can do all those things that are necessary. Unfortunately, I don't think that Vescovy will be there because I don't think one way or the other. If people want to make their own arguments that Vescovy's better, so be it. But he's not appreciably better than Josiah, which means that if you're telling me it'll be hard for me to see him being 35 spots better.
Yeah.
And basically, we're in the range of being 30 spots better.
Yeah.
Than Josiah.
For some context, the guys who they just announced for 41 through 44 were Caleb Daniels of Villanova, Darius McGee of, I think, Liberty. Yeah, Liberty. Harrison Ingram for Stanford, and then Darren Holmes II for Dayton. So those are that guys. And then in the 45-48 was Terrence Shannon Jr. for Illinois. Tyrese Hunter, who ball fans will know because we talked about him on the podcast, and Timmy Allen for Texas. So Timmy Allen and Tyrese Hunter, 46-47. Then P.J. Hall, who was also a Tennessee recruit target for Clemson for 48. So that's the range we're in right now. So for context for all fans, is Vescovy on the same level as those guys, basically, or better, I guess, technically, by the Field of 68 standards?
Right. And when you watch a guy like Vescovy's game, his greatest attribute, and you talked about it before, is his shooting. Are you going to put a shooter, top 40 player in the country, and fair foul? I mean, that's just, I think that's his greatest trait is that, scoring and shooting. Now, he's not a bad playmaker. I never thought he was great at it, but I never thought he was bad either. He doesn't make bad decisions, but a lot of his passes are just made to look, hate to say it like this, but I always felt like there was probably a little more pizzazz than was necessary, which is fair. It's fair. Not a big deal. I mean, I'm 41 years old. I mean, generationally, that's probably, looks a lot different. So there's a lot of things I see my son do, who's 17. I watch he and his teammates play ball, and I'm just like, did you really have to do that? But I mean, and that's just some of it's just me. But and I'm admitting my own biases there. But I think that he's just at his core mainly a scorer. And I think nationally he's perceived that way. You've got a guy on that Field of 68 panel in Terence Oglesby, who was an amazing shooter. Amazing. Go look up some Terence Oglesby shooting highlights. Like, I understand everybody, is angry because of something he said last year. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he said something that ticked off a bunch of Tennessee fans. He was talking about how they didn't call a bunch of fouls in the game, and Tennessee's a physical team, and they got away with some stuff. And I don't remember exactly how he framed it, but that was the gist of it. But you go type in Terence Oglesby. Now, obviously, you see how his career ended. Fair foul. Can't do what he did in his last college basketball game. That will get you ejected 10 times out of 10. But in terms of his shooting ability, so Terrence knows somebody, like he's seen a person like Vescovy before, because that's kind of who he was as a player. Like, I covered Terrence when he was at Bradley Central High School here in Cleveland. I saw a little bit of him at Clemson. That guy will shoot from 30. So he knows shooters. And I could make an argument that he's probably a similar sort of player to a guy like Vescovy. And so it's different there. Like, that's a different skill set. That's a different talent. There's a different level of importance there. It's a little easier, fair or foul, a little easier to find a 6'2", 6'3" shooter in this day and age than it is to find a guy who's 6'6" and can play multiple positions.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Like, it's... I would be interested to see, like, again, I don't think he's going to be top 30, top 40 even in the Field of 60. I'd be interested to see where they would, if they, if I were to ask somebody that does stuff for the Field of 68, because they have a pretty good staff over that does stuff. I know guys like Sean Paul and Brian Ralph and Andy Dekoff, like I've had them on the podcast before, I think, or maybe when we had the SEC podcast, I forget. But I know I've talked with them before. I think it might have been, we're still an SEC podcast that I had a couple of those guys on, but I know I've had Sean Paul on before because of his name, and yep. I can't think of anybody but the rapper, the hip hop artist.
I'm singing the song in my head right now. I'm serious. Like, that goes back to a different time for me.
Oh yeah. No, I heard this off topic. I heard there's a song they were playing in the gym the other day, and it was Sean Paul, and I was like, man, this takes me back.
Well, the problem is there's two different Sean Pauls.
Oh yeah.
There is the Sean Paul from young bloods. And then, of course, there was the Sean Paul. I don't really care what people say. Yeah, that guy. So, yeah, there's two different ones. But either way, I feel bad for the actual Sean Paul because he has been drugged into this conversation. Now, what we're now talking about reggae guys and, hip hop artists from Atlanta. So,
to my point, I forgot what I was talking about. Gosh. About Vescovy, I would be curious to see where they'd have him actually ranked if he's just outside the top 100. But it doesn't matter. Tennessee, if you go back to a couple of Tennessee's best teams it had, Grant Williams obviously would have been Rick Barnes' best team. Grant Williams would have been top 20 probably, if not better in terms of like ranking top players because he was invited to. Oh God, I forgot the award. Whatever award that Zion won that year, the basically best player in college basketball, Naismith.
The Naismith Award.
Yeah, he was invited, like he was there in attendance for that, so he's considered by some to be one of the top, 6, 10, at least top 10 players in college basketball. So obviously he would have been there. But how many other guys on that team would have been in the top 100? You'd had Admiral, I would say, but even preseason stuff, I don't think people would have put Jordan Bone there. People wouldn't have put Bowden. They wouldn't have put Turner. They wouldn't have put Alexander. Like I think you would have had Grant and Admiral.
I think Admiral would.
Yeah, Grant and Admiral would be the two guys. That'd been it. Like, how many of Tennessee's best teams have had a bunch of top 100, top 50 type players? Because you look at the one that made the Elite Eight run. I mean, your best player, at least from potential perspective, got kicked off the team mid-year, and Tyler Smith. Like he was the guy that had the best, I guess, NBA potential of anybody on that roster. From what you would consider like a star ranking, perspective. Wayne Chisholm was the best player on that team, in my opinion. I guess you could throw in, I just forgot some of the roster of that. JB Prince was an athlete. He wouldn't be in there, but I mean, Chisholm wouldn't have been super high up.
Cam Tatum.
Yeah, like
he would not
even
have.
Then, like I don't think
Bobby Mays.
Yeah,
no.
Preseason, those guys wouldn't have been like the bunch of top 100 players. Wayne Chisholm might have been in top 100, but he would have been, kind of where Josiah is in that range, and maybe even lower ranked than Josiah. Yeah. Like you wouldn't have had a whole lot of top 100 players from that team. So this isn't to say that, just because some publication doesn't, just has just Josiah, not Vescovy, and not other guys ranked in top 100 players in college basketball, that Tennessee's, maybe they are going to underachieve. Some of Tennessee's best teams have had a lot of, I wouldn't say no name, but a lot of guys that aren't considered the elite of the elite players. And Tennessee still had some success and still won, conference titles, have gone on and made, Sweet 16 to Elite 8 runs in the tournament. So, like, you don't, that's the beauty of college basketball, Gene, is that you don't need a superstar to go make a run. Like, you look at we highlighted it a few times before. I mean, that Baylor team had some really darn good players, but they didn't have a Naismith winner. They didn't have, you had really good all-conference players and really good players on that team. But you don't have to go be a Kentucky or a Duke or North Carolina and land multiple 5-stars in a recruiting class to go have a successful season and then a successful postseason run in college basketball. In football, you kind of have to recruit well and kind of have to, in the transfer portal, land a lot of transfers to be good. Like, it's hard a lot because of the size of the roster, especially. It's a lot harder in football to have success and not be, not have a bunch of top 100 guys or top, high end players, blue chip prospects. You can do that in basketball a lot easier because it's obviously a much different game. It's a much different style of play from what football is, with the athleticism and with just hot and cold shooting nights, but also with the size of the rosters. It's a significantly smaller roster than football. So you don't need as many talented players. If you have a roster that is comprised of really solid players, there's a good chance you can punch up and beat a team that is ranked higher than you and thought to be better than you because you work better as a team and have more team chemistry, or you're just a better team that night. So there's just a lot more parity in college basketball. So my point in all that was that, Tennessee may just have Josiah viewed as this guy. And that, again, this is just one publication. I'll be really interested to see when we get closer to the season, Gene, when we have the preseason all SEC teams, how many Vols get on there? Because I think both Vescovy and Josiah get on there. Are either one of those guys first team guys? There's a good chance I think one of them will be. I'll be interested to see it. But does Ziegler get on there? How many preseason all SEC teams or all SEC members, does Tennessee have on this roster? Because I think that to me is going to be intriguing to see, just because it goes back to the whole respect and prestige that Rick Barnes has earned kind of thing. I think that goes back to that, and the fact that those guys are multi-year players. Those are guys that Barnes and his staff identified and really wanted. And especially in Josiah's case, I mean, they beat out, a Duke and a Clemson for Josiah, and obviously Clemson basketball is not what Clemson football is, but they're still respected for the most part. And obviously Duke is Duke, but I think this team is still. It's just like you said, rankings don't matter in sports, period, but they really particularly, I don't think, matter a ton in basketball. Like, it's just, I think we talked about this last week and at the end of the episode too, Jing. It just does not matter about rankings in basketball. Football, it doesn't matter. Baseball, it doesn't. Like, rankings don't matter because it's just opinions for the most part of how people view things. But like, man, in basketball, like, it's almost stupid how much rankings don't matter, but then also how much we pay attention. Like, there's whole organizations built out there on rankings, like KenPom. Like, I think KenPom's smart. I think he does a good job what he does. But you have him. You have, I mean, there's just so many. I have Eric Haslam, we've talked on the podcast before. Like, I love the work he does, all his analytics and stuff. But man, you could have the 195th ranked team go out and upset the number 5 ranked team in KenPom, and it not be a massive shocker to me, because that's college basketball. You have a 16 seed beat a 1 seed. You had Kentucky lose to St. Peter's in the NCAA tournament. Like, that stuff like that you don't get in football. You don't really get a whole lot of that in baseball either, because at least in college baseball, because you have series for one. But like, just that's the beauty of college basketball, is that on any given night, almost any team can beat almost any other team. That's just the beauty of college basketball. Why I love the sport so much, is because you don't know. Like, you don't know any given night, anything can happen.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it. That is what makes it good. I mean, and like when you look at the rankings, and like I said, I'm always, Mr. Anti-ranking, probably to a lot of people's frustration, because they're like, man, why doesn't he care about it? This 5-star guy we got. Let me pose this, because I was just thinking about this again while you were talking. A few years ago, if Field of 68 were doing this, follow me down this road, where do you think they would have? What do you think they would have ranked Zion? You think Zion gets ranked in that top 10 poll, that top 100?
In preseason, yes, because wasn't he was he number 1 overall recruit that year? I think so. He was close to it, if he wasn't.
Yeah. Next question. Do you think they would have done the same thing with R.J. Barrett, who was a more highly ranked recruit in that class?
Yeah, because I think
Cam Reddish.
Yeah, because they say Cam, RJ, and Zion were all top 10 players in that recruiting cycle, so they probably would have been at least top 15, if not top 10 players going into that season.
So, I guess my question is, do you think they do anything with, say, Julian Phillips?
I don't know why, Gene. He'd never crossed my mind. But you make a very good point. He's a guy who was a bona fide 5-star, a top 20 prospect. Like, he wasn't just a borderline 5-star. Like, he was a very highly regarded 5-star. That's a really good question. He
may not. Like, he probably won't, because I just can't see you doing that with a guy that he wasn't highly ranked enough. Like, I imagine that Imani Bates last year would have probably been there. Mm-hmm. I can't even really think of the top prospects this year. I hate that. But yeah, I mean, so that would be the one.
Well, I'll say for context, the South Carolina kid, G.G. Jackson, he was in the 40s. Like, I just looked at him. He was one of the ones that was in like around the 40-50 range. So he was number 1. I mean, that's different than Zion, but he was a guy who was in that 40-50 range, and he was, considered by some as the number 1 prospect.
Right, and so that's what. Now, would he have been number 1 in 2022?
Right.
Because I know he was 1 in 2023. Mm-hmm. But I mean, maybe he would have, maybe one. I don't know. But I think that's where that's where, to me, it would get kind of interesting. It's just in the fact that, okay, like that'd be the one that some people would maybe get upset about because, he hadn't done anything, but also as a credit to the fact that the kid is a highly regarded prospect, and I don't know how that would be handled. Like if you put him at like say 39 and there's no Vescovy on the list, like how would the fan base feel about that? Because sometimes it's, because college basketball is not about production. When you're looking at these rankings and stuff,
right?
It's not like sometimes you'll see first team preseason all conference kids that are freshmen and like, really? Can they play a game first? But that's what they do. And sometimes I think BJ Boston was a couple years ago for Kentucky, and we see how that turned out. So like I wouldn't be stunned if that was the case. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I mean, I think that was just another avenue to go down, because like that would be something that would be a very college basketball thing to do. And look, man, sometimes it's people. I'm not saying it's the case here, but it would be the ultimate troll job for somebody like the Field of 68, who has somebody who may not be the biggest fan of Tennessee on there, to put somebody on the top 100, not the kid who's probably nearing 800-900, close to 1,000 points in his career. And instead choosing some freshman who hadn't played who hadn't played a minute and only chose the school because the school that he chose fired his coach amid an NCAA investigation, which will probably, I don't know what happens with the coach, but yeah, that's how the kid ended up at your school in the first place. So that would be an ultimate troll job, but I don't think that's the case. I just think that's this whole thing is just, expectations. You're looking at a guy who, can do a lot of things, and that's why you put a kid like that on the list.
By the way, for those who are interested, at least on 247, the top 5 recruits for this 2022 cycle that are now, going to be freshmen this year were Derek Lively II, who went to Duke, Dreek Whitehead, who went to Duke, Nick Smith, who went to Arkansas, which that's, really good pull for them, Kyle Flipowski, who went to Duke, and then Dylan Mitchell, who went to Texas, and then number 6 was G.G. Jackson for South Carolina. So, man, just that's like, we just talked about it. That's like that whatever 2018-19 haul for Duke that had 3 of the top 5 players that went to Duke. They literally got 3 of the top 4 players on 247 in this class. So that's another reason why Duke is. Maybe that's one of the reasons why they had John Shire ranked so high, Gene, on the recruiting list. I didn't realize how good of a job he did in his one recruiting cycle so far. Again, I don't want to rehash what we said last week, but about why he shouldn't be as high as he is, because he's not even been a head coach yet. But dang, that's a good haul for your first recruiting haul as a head coach, getting 3 of the top 4 guys by a service. Like, gosh, that's really good. So yeah, Tennessee, by the way, Julian Phillips is ranked 13th in the 247. I think this is the composite rankings. Yeah, in the 247 composite, he was 13th. Then he was 19th in their regular rankings. Don't know where he was in on 3. I'll look that up really quick before we end the show, because now I'm curious where he was on 3. It was actually a 4-star on there. Interesting. They had him ranked lower than anybody. He was 45 overall on 3, and that's interesting. Oh, wait, but then over here they have him as 13th as the consensus. So I don't know. He's a 5-star on their consensus, but it looks like on the actual on 3 ranking he was rated lower. So I don't know. I guess it depends on. Okay, I guess that's wrong, because now it's okay. Here's the actual ranking. I don't know where the 45 thing is, but that's what it's showing right now on the college rating. But then on the actual on 3 thing here, had him 15th. So 15th on 3, 19th on 247, 14th on Rivals, and then ESPN had him 13th. So he's a consensus top 20 prospect and kind of around that 15th ranking. So, I mean, you're right, Gene. I mean, I think that was a good. I don't know why he didn't cross my mind because he is a really high rate prospect. So I will be interested to see if he's the guy that sneaks in there. But like you said, I don't know that they'll rank him that high because I think they'll rank Duke's players up there. I'll be interested to see where their freshmen come in or where Nick Smith for Arkansas comes in. Because those are top 5 prospects, and I will be intrigued to see kind of where they land on those lists. But we're talking about preseason list. We're in the list season right now of college basketball. We're getting closer and closer to games and getting closer and closer to the season, Gene, but we're still in list season, and we will be for another solid month or so here. But that'll be it for this episode. I do want to thank all of you who tuned in, and if you got this far, thank you so much. You listened to over an hour worth of a podcast about pretty much all about Tennessee basketball, so really, thank you so much for that. That means a lot to me, means a lot to Gene, means a lot to just all of us here who do things for the show behind the scenes or here in front of the camera / behind the mic. So thank you all so much. Again, if you're on YouTube, give this video a like and share it around. And if you listen to this podcast, obviously share that around too and leave us a review. A 5-star review would be fantastic. Signing off for Gene, I am Nathanael. This has been another episode of Vol Basketball Fever. Thank you for watching Vol Basketball Fever. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel while you're here. We appreciate all your support, and the show wouldn't be possible without Vol fans like you. Thank you.